I think Harris hasn't quite sort of sold the case as to who she is and what she stands for, and she didn't sufficiently separate herself from Joe Biden.
Let's start with just how you make the state of the races as we are at the moment. Doug, start with you. Trump.
Yeah.
He's just said he's tired. He said he's had 62 days without a break. He's been rallying, if you think about it now, for 8 years. He's got quite good at rallying. But what do you make of the state of his campaign as it concludes?
I think it's honestly good. Like I said, I'm not trying to spin here. I do believe ultimately that President Trump's going to win comfortably tomorrow. I actually do believe, as a contrarian, that I believe the race will be called by 10 or 11 o'clock tomorrow night. I think he'll have a comfortable margin. I think he'll be somewhere north of 290 electoral votes. We'll wait and see. But I think they're confident. They're not overconfident. And, it's one of those things where no matter what, to the last second, you got to get the vote out.
Jim, what do you make of? We'll talk about Trump and then we'll talk about the Democrats. What do you make of how the Trump campaign's finishing?
Well, I think they could have finished better. I think they've had a little bit of difficulty the last week or so. I still think, like Doug, my gut says that Trump will win, although it frankly still could go either way. I think he's had a few stumbles in the past week, but may not be enough to hold him back from victory because he has certain wins at his back at the same time, like inflation, et cetera. So it'll be a bit of a nail biter, but at the same time, the trends may be apparent fairly early in the evening.
And what do you think's benefited him then? You think inflation to the state of the economy? What else has benefited him?
Well, people are dissatisfied with the status quo and they want to change, and so that naturally benefits the challenger. In this case, it's Trump, and people have a kind of a rosier view of his time in office than they did when he was in office. Actually, so that's kind of benefited him. That look back at his presidency. So I think he's got the state of the economy working for him, the concern about immigration working for him as well, and I think Harris hasn't quite sort of sold the case as to who she is and what she stands for, and she didn't sufficiently separate herself from Joe Biden. Now again, it's still a 50-50 race in some respects, but you still could see it not being such a close race in the Electoral College.
Doug, do you think that Kamala Harris has done a better job than Joe Biden would have done? Is she more of a challenge to Trump than Biden would have been?
I think ultimately, that's correct. I was writing, I'm one of the main columnists for The Hill in Washington, D.C., and for the last year and a half, as Jim knows, I've been writing columns categorically stating that I didn't believe Joe Biden would be the nominee come November. And, so the party made the correct move or, in a way, enforcing him out. But I also believe they made a huge mistake in selecting Kamala Harris as their nominee, as opposed to, and Jim can probably knows more about this than I do, but there were a number of Democrats that wanted to have an open convention at the Democratic convention this past August in Chicago, because they just wanted to try to field the best candidate possible. And many of them did not believe it was Kamala Harris. As a matter of fact, before Kamala Harris was installed, a number of those same Democrats were saying a lot of negative things about her and about Joe Biden. So would it have been healthier for the Democratic Party to have an open convention and pick someone from that? I suspect it would, and I believe they would have gotten a better candidate out of that, if they had gone that way.
Jim, what do you reckon though? Because people would say Kamala Harris has had a campaign without stumbles. There's not been any big moment that she seems to have got wrong. Now, there's an argument about whether she's going to energize the voters or not, and we'll find out in 24 hours' time. But she's had a solid campaign. There's not been any problems with the campaign. Has she proved herself the best candidate in the end, do you think?
Well, I think she's been a better candidate than people thought she might be. And so in that sense, but I think she's played it too safe. And that may ultimately not be to her benefit. She didn't have a Sister Souljah moment. She didn't find a way to separate herself from the left wing of the party. She didn't find a way to separate herself from Joe Biden because I think she was risk averse. She was kind of playing it too safe. And that may prove to be her undoing. I think otherwise, she, in terms of the optics and the flow of the campaign, I think she's done better than people expected. And certainly in the debate, she did quite well, frankly. But I think she insulated herself from the media too much. He still hasn't had a real news conference the whole campaign, which is pretty extraordinary when you think about it.
Doug, have Americans somehow factored in Trump crazy in a way that people outside of America can't fully fathom? I mean, if this race was to be happening in any other Western country, Trump would be gone. I mean, Trump would have no chance if he was. I mean, with this, I live in a country, Britain, which regularly votes in conservative governments, had a conservative government until the last one for 14 years, and Trump would be nowhere if he were here because people regard him as not statesman-like, crazy-looking, crazy talking. And yet in America, that seems to be working. Try and explain that to us as we look ahead to this election, which is 50-50. He's already won once. He may well win again. To many people, that's incomprehensible, and yet it is deeply, deeply plausible. Can you explain that to us?
I think it's entirely plausible, and again, I believe it will happen. And to your point, while I wouldn't say he's crazy, what I would say is a lot of voters, tens of millions of voters in the United States, see Trump being Trump, and they're fine with that. The reason why Trump caught on in 2016, and I've had this conversation numerous times, is because I believe so many Republicans, and even a large number of Democrats, were just tired of the entrenched elites from both sides that were letting them down time and again. And so I believe when then businessman Trump came on the scene, they were looking for anyone that wasn't a professional politician, and basically they just said, you know what, we're going to throw a Hail Mary pass to this guy in the end zone and hope he catches it. And again, and you have to remember too that now he has a record to run on. And one of the things that's hurting Harris the most, I believe, and this is when I'm talking to, blue collar friends that I know working class blue collar friends that I know back in deep blue Massachusetts. And even though they don't like Trump, they're going to vote for him because they say the same thing and over and over again, that their lives, in fact, were better 4 years ago than they are now. So, and that's ultimately the deciding factor for so many people, because it's about their family, it's about their children, it's about paying the bills, it's about paying the mortgage, it's about keeping crime away from their front door. So so do they think Trump, goes a little bit overboard at times? Absolutely. But they also know that he has a record to run on. They like that record from 4 years ago. They know he's not a fascist. They know he's not a dictator. They know he would walk away from power. And ultimately, they just want to have the best lives possible. And I believe because of that, they're just going to lean towards Trump tomorrow.
Jim, which is it though? Because in some ways that's two things. That he's either the anti-establishment guy and he's not the traditional politician, or he's the guy with a record. And if he manages to be both of those things, that's a very potent combination, but it's pretty hard to be both of those things. Do you think it's the anti-establishment thing? We talk a lot about the establishment now, and I wonder whether one of the problems that Democrats have is that they've become the establishment, and so Trump just seems like a contrarian figure anyway. And of course he is a contrarian figure.
Yeah, it's a very unusual race. By the way, I should mention Boris Johnson is a pretty interesting, different kind of politician himself, which is fascinating. And you see trends in like countries like Italy and Argentina, where you have sort of out of the ordinary politicians rising to some measure of success. What's kind of strange or different about this election is this is the third time Trump is going to be on the ballot in November. That hasn't happened very often before. You have to go back to FDR and I think Teddy Roosevelt, maybe before that. I'm not sure, but that itself is unique. And I think you're right in that. Who is the authority and who's the anti-authority figure here, and it kind of is very kind of mixed up situation. And I think the parties are grappling with that. Like, who's the elite party? It used to be the Republicans were the country club set, the big oil, the big pharma, the big insurance company people. And then now they've kind of morphed into more of a working class party, or at least aspire to. Whereas the Democrats used to be the working person's party, and they've in danger of becoming the elite party. And so I think a reckoning will happen if Harris loses. There'll be a reckoning for the party itself in the future.
But Jim, she might win, and she might win because the Republicans have a policy around abortion that whenever there's been a sort of referendum in the last year or so, the public seem to be more closer to the Democrat position than the Republican position. Is that the key? Is this the gendered election where abortion, women's rights might be the thing that makes the Democrats win?
It may be, and if she does win, I think a lot will be hung on that idea, and I think there'll be some validity to it. So the question is, who has the bigger hidden vote? Is it does the gender gap with men benefit Trump more or less than the gender gap for women? Although I would argue that there are certainly sufficient women who are pro-life and a sufficient number of women who are pro-life and concerned about immigration and inflation, et cetera. So I think that's kind of it's a little hard. Sometimes we get into these stereotypes where so it may not be quite as neat as that.
So we've got a Democrat and a Republican here. Are you both saying that this is, if you had to put money down, it's Trump? Doug, you are saying that, aren't you? And you think it's Trump by a margin?
Yeah, I think again, I believe he's going to win comfortably tomorrow. Like I said, north of 290 electoral votes. They have elections to prove people like me wrong, of course. But that's my honest belief.
Jim?
Well, I hope we were just talking earlier. I was involved with the election in 2000, which of course was a nail biter. We didn't know for 35 days after what happened. I'm hoping for the country's sake that doesn't happen again. I would say it's probably going to Trump, perhaps not by as big a margin as Doug says, but I think he may have the upper hand in the vote totals. Although I wouldn't be shocked if the alternative happens and Harris wins.
Yeah, we shall see. Guys, really good to speak to you. Thank you so much for that. We will see what happens. It's getting very, very exciting now.
You bet. My pleasure.